What is the biggest mistake 99% of tech founders make with their MVPs? How can you, as a tech founder, avoid those mistakes? And what are the best tools to help you do that? That's what we'll talk about in today's podcast. My guest today is Shoukri Kattan. He's a battle-hardened, startup-life-hardened CTO, founder, angel investor, startup advisor, and rumor has it, biohacker. Did I get it right, Shukri?
Yeah, you did. It's awesome. Hey, hi everybody.
Can you tell us a little bit about that biohacking thing? Because I find it quite intriguing.
Yeah, for sure. So I got into biohacking in the early, I think 2013, and I actually got into that because I was at a previous point in life I was obese. I was 200 and probably 30 pounds, heavy, and very, very sick. And at that time, I kind of stumbled upon Dave Asprey online. I started reading about bulletproof coffee, but then quickly kind of, went down that route and started to understand how biology works. And at the previous point, I'm kind of a coder, and so you can think of me also as a hacker, white hat, not black hat hacker. And I kind of saw the parallels between hacking and kind of thinking of software or applications as a black box. Like as a hacker, you think of a system as a black box, and you're trying to kind of prod and poke the inputs and outputs to understand how that box behaves, and then ideally find a hole or holes that you can exploit. Yeah, and I think of the human biology in the same way. We really don't fully understand how the body works. We don't understand how the mind works. And we have, ideas, theories that we've refined and built over time, but it's still not complete. And so another way to look at the human body is kind of treat it as a black box. And maybe I don't know how everything inside works, but as I change inputs and outputs, things change inside. And you might be wondering, like, what is inputs and outputs? Inputs and outputs is breathing, you're taking in oxygen. Food is another one of these inputs. Sunlight is a huge one. Darkness is another one. So kind of everything that hits the human body, you can think of it as input, and stuff that you excrete is outputs. And so can I start to measure inputs, outputs, and how the body responds in relation to that? And that kind of led me on the whole kind of biohacking journey.
That's fascinating. So, and obviously you are not obese anymore, so it must have worked.
No, it did. It took me a while to kind of nail it, but I would say I was extremely unhealthy from pretty much, I would say, age 4. So I was always obese. Like from age 4 to age, I'd say 26, I was like overweight, miserable, and then eventually cracked the code around like 27, 28. And then I can say I'm 39 now, and I've never felt better, man. It's awesome.
I think this is a story we need to save for another time because this is I find this fascinating. Now, before we dive deep into today's topic, which is the biggest mistake 99% of tech founders make with their MVPs, before we get to that, can you tell us a bit about yourself? What's your story?
I started my startup journey while I was in university. So I was in Israel at the time. And before I finished university, a friend of mine calls me one day and he says, "Hey, there's this startup, you should try to join them." And at that time, I was exposed to tech, but I didn't really know what startups are or what makes something a startup. So I went for an interview. I met this gentleman. His name is V. Schreiber. And all I remember is like a brilliant guy. He asked me a bunch of questions about computers and about data, like, science and what computer science. And that went well. And all I know is I got the job. And then I went in, started to learn what startups are. We were backed by like heavy names in the space. So we were backed by a Benchmark Capital. They're out of the US. The founder himself was brilliant. Like the guy, insane track record, sold startups to IBM before, multiple exits under his belt, and yet we failed. And so that to me was like a mind-blowing, and like, when I started the journey in that startup, I was like, dreaming of, oh man, like you read TechCrunch and you read all the, the glamour and all the fun stuff and kind of all the stories and all the funding. And that's like, I looked forward to that and I'm like, I can't wait for us to exit. But then one day we have a meeting and the CEO walks in and he says, "Hey guys, looks like we're gonna shut down."
Oh, wow.
And it was a sad moment, but at the same time, like I was bit by the bug and I was like, ooh, this was awesome. I learned a ton doing things at scale. So I out of university, and the first thing I built was like a file system based on AWS S3, which was like new at the time. So the entire cloud computing, keep in mind the time frame for this is like 2007, 2008. Like nobody heard of cloud computing yet. Box.net was new at the time, and it was like us and them at the same time. And it's fascinating to see like Box.net still alive today. We died in 2008.
So I find this fascinating. Let's dive just a tiny bit into this because this is interesting. So you're basically saying, so you had in that startup, you had all the ingredients for success. You know, you had funding, you had a super experienced, super successful founder, and everything lined up pretty much.
Yeah.
Still, it failed. Are there any lessons you can tell us about this? How, why?
Absolutely. After that startup, so maybe I'll jump a little bit forward and then I'll come back. So after that startup, I met another interesting founder who was in Canada, and I kind of moved to Canada. But as I did, I kept thinking about why we failed. Of course, I had the chat with the CEO as well, and I kind of tried to understand his perspective, because whether success or failure, a lot of us, you know, are you familiar with the narrative fallacy?
The narrative fallacy? No, not really.
The idea is and I think Jeff Bezos, I think he talks about this. You really don't know why somebody succeeded and somebody failed. However, you can come up with stories and explanations about why. And now, you know, is that story the truth, or this is just one version of the truth? And you'll talk to three people, even in the same startup, and they'll give you three versions of why this failed or why this succeeded. My analysis of the situation was two or three things. One, startups do not live in vacuum. So if I go back to 2008, the financial crisis was there. So we were backed by heavy VCs, but then as the financial climate changed, no more funding. Like VCs were kind of trying to preserve capital at that time. The second, I also believe we were ahead of our time. And this is market timing. And I learned, and I see this over and over again. You can take the same team, the same idea, and execute it a few years ahead of its time, and it's gonna fail. But then you get it at the right moment and like a rocket. And I believe that if I think about what we were trying to do, we were building a cloud-based operating system. There was no cloud. The internet bandwidth in most of the world at that time was still not there, hasn't caught up. And then it was too broad of an undertaking. And here's the fascinating thing. I remember when I told you I was building a cloud-based operating system, right? So what we did is we created, think of it as FTP protocol, right? Like FTP, you can FTP files in and out. So we built something very, very similar that allowed people to take their files, put them on a drive. At the same time, Box.net did only that. What we were doing is we're building the whole cloud operating system. So the file storage was a tiny piece, and then we were kind of integrating Zoho and file editors, and we did too many things. But if we actually looked at the data, and this blows my mind till this day, if I look at the product and what was the most used thing, it was the file system I built. And so we had it under our nose the entire time. Like you see, nothing else was used, and we had a ton of people storing data. We had more than 500,000 users, and like the most things, if you look at what they do as they kind of joined the platform, it was storing a ton of files. So these are my lessons. My lessons is like, you don't operate in vacuum. That's one. Your startup is like a wave, and you have to ride the right wave. So you come at the right time and you can take off, and you kind of get the timing a little bit off and you see no traction, and really listen to users and listen to the data. And I think we didn't do a good job of that.
Very interesting. Now, people would like to connect with you on LinkedIn. What's the best way to find you?
So Only CTO. So you can find me on all social media with the handle Only CTO, or you look up Shoukri Kattan, SHOUKRI. Kattan, Kattan, or you can also check bitlab.co, which is my company.
Okay, well, the handle Only CTO.
Only CTO. That's
the handle.
Yeah.
Cool.
I'm only a CTO. Nothing else.
Excellent. Now, finally, we get to this fascinating question. As an experienced founder, CTO, angel investor, and startup advisor, you get to see a lot of startups. And the question is, what do you think is the biggest mistake tech founders make, specifically with their MVPs?
I think there's a few big mistakes. The first one is not doing discovery before you start to build an MVP. For a lot of first-time founders, the way they approach the process is, the way they think of the process as, come up with an idea, build it, now try to go take it to the market and try to sell it. This approach could work. And in fact, many of the most creative products started like that. Started with somebody building a cool new technology and then trying to go out there and find the use for it. However, this is not the most cash efficient way. And if you're tackling less creative and more kind of B2B, there's a better approach. And the better approach, in my opinion, and actually that's what we teach and kind of coach the founders who work with us, is this. Before you build anything, you want to start with, who am I building this for? One of my favorite examples is, I talk to a founder and he says, hospitals. I'm like, wait, a hospital is not a person. You're not building for a hospital. You're building for somebody in a hospital. Who is that person? So the first thing is being very, very clear on who is the user you're building this for. If you get this wrong, none of the stuff you do after matters whatsoever, because then you're building the wrong thing, you're building for the wrong user, there is no resonance, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. So that's number one. You define who you want to build this for. And then you go and say, maybe I should talk to these people, right? To understand that maybe what I'm building is not a pain point for them. Maybe it's not a severe pain point for them. Stephen Blank has a saying, it's like, you want to find those people who have a hair on fire kind of problem. Why hair on fire? Because if it's a mild problem, maybe they'll put it off. There's no sense of urgency, right? That's one. And so you want people who have a very, very painful problem. And ideally, whatever you're building must be in that like top 3 pain points. So discovery is the first step. So you go and you meet these people. But this is also another thing that founders get wrong. They think of discovery as a sales call. It's not. Discovery is, I'm just getting to know that person or persona, their hopes, fears, and dreams, and then their pain points. Like, what is screaming at them right now? What are the biggest pain points? And then, is the thing that I'm building in the top 3? If it's not, forget about it. You're not going to get traction. It's going to be way, way more difficult. So one, who's the user? Number 2, now that you've defined the user, you can say, where do they want to go? People don't buy features. I don't buy AI HR. I'm not in the market for AI HR. I have a problem, ideally a severe problem, and I'm looking for something to solve this problem. And it's usually, I'm trying to take my business somewhere, right? Because I'm not buying solutions or not buying software just for the sake of buying the software. If I think of like a sales tool, let's think somebody's trying to buy like a B2B sales tool. All I know is today I get 5 customers and I need to get to 100. What you're selling me is not a sales tool. What you're selling me is get 100 customers easy. That's what you're selling, right? And so you define your customer first. Then you define the transformation, or what is that tool gonna do for me? So customer, transformation, and then the other thing you wanna know, great, so I've defined the customer. How do I reach this customer? Am I gonna cold call them? Am I gonna email them? Am I gonna fax them? Am I gonna go on Twitter and hunt them down? What does that look like? How do I reach out to these people? And once I've defined these 3 things, by the way, you can test a lot of things before you build the product. And in fact, I'm probably the only CTO who says, don't build tech until you know who the customer is, you understand the transformation, you know the channel to reach them, and if you know these 3 things, you can also start to test the price point, right? You don't need the product to test the price point. All of these things are actually very, very cheap and easy to test because all of them are either words out of your mouth or words on a sales page or words in an ad. And so you can test the customer, the offer, the price point, all of this based on a mock-up. Yet I see founders jumping through all of this and starting to build the technology.
Because building is easy, right? Building is the easiest part.
And it's worse for technical founders because, and I made this mistake myself, right? Like not to, I'm not, sitting on a pedestal and I'm like, oh yeah, like you guys, no, I've done exactly that. I failed as a founder because I started building first before I talked to users. And my intuition as a technical guy, I'm like, product. And even if I talk to non-technical founders, because I guess they feel that lack. So once you kind of give them somebody who's able to build the tech, you give them the superpower and now it's easy for them to abuse it. And they abuse it by One, building before it's necessary, building too much. That's the second kind of killer mistake, is the MVP is everything. No. Founders think that the purpose of the MVP is to kind of go to market and sell a lot of it. But no, the MVP is a learning tool. So as you identify the problem, you start to say, okay, I think I know the process to solving this problem. And a lot of times I actually encourage founders to say, can you do what I call a minimum manual product? Imagine that I didn't build the software. What is the outcome that they're trying to buy? And actually, I got into a very interesting debate a few days ago on this. So one guy is saying, I'm building an AI tool that generates logos. How can I validate that before building the tool? And I'm like, easy. I'm not buying AI building logos. I'm buying an easy logo. Like, I'm buying a logo, right? So I'm gonna tell you, here's the thing that I want, and then you're gonna go design logos. So a very cheap MVP is you go on Twitter or you go on LinkedIn and, hey, do you want a logo? Hey, do you want a logo? I can make you a logo for $5. And then that's an MVP. You validated the demand, at least, for that. And then eventually we take you out of the loop and put a software to do the thing you're doing. And I've seen a lot of startups that started that way, started with like a minimum manual product, or they start doing the thing as a service, and then eventually, you take the people out, you put the software in, and it does the same job. And now you've actually done quite a bit of validation on the price point and even the process. So now the software building becomes easy because I know exactly what the software has to do.
This is fascinating. This is very enlightening to understand that, you don't really need to code anything before you validate. You really can do this manual thing. And I read in one of your posts there that you said, an MVP should never take more than 30 days, max.
There are exceptions, but in most parts, when you get to building tech, I don't think you can get, you can get certain MVPs done in 30 days. There are MVPs that take more like 90. I've done one which took like 9 months, but that is a whole other case. And in that case, before we actually spent the time and cost involved with that, we had the purchase order on the table, that's the validation we need to go and start building, right? And I did this mistake with a couple of startups, but then the third startup I did on my own. I'm technical, I can build, I have the right people to build. But I actually went and I got a purchase order in my hand from a customer, and with that check, then I went to build.
Okay, another question. So this is primarily for B2B, and I think it's brilliant for that. How would you approach this for B2C?
B2C is really interesting. I think you can do something in the B2C as validation in a couple of ways. One is, if you think about Kickstarters and Kickstarter campaigns, so this is like the crowdfunding is one. An easier one is just landing page, right? Whether you want to test the offer. So what I would do is, let's say I'm going to sell, new types of shoes. One way to do it is launch a landing page, because think about it, like nobody touches the product. In most e-commerce startups or most physical products, nobody touches and plays with the product before they buy it. So then what you're testing is essentially, first of all, can you communicate what you're trying to build, right? To do that is very easy. You can buy an ad. You don't have to spend $1 million. You spend $100 worth of ads. You can test the copy of the ad. You can test the conversion from the ad to the landing page. You can test the landing page itself. And you can even get it to the buy button. And maybe when I click it, nothing happens. Or maybe I put an order. And you know what? Worst case, if I decide the idea is bad, I'm going to refund the people. I'm not in the business of scamming the people, right? So then you like prove it by proving that people went to the ad, went to the page, clicked the buy button, or took whatever action you expect them to take. And if you've seen that, that's a pretty good way to prove it. The other is you could go like a crowdfunding campaign or crowdsourcing campaign, or I think these are at least two main methods, but there's others. Like I think there's a ton of other ways you can validate before you actually build the thing.
Great points. Now, in one of your posts I've seen on LinkedIn, by the way, I recommend you follow Shoukri on LinkedIn or connect with him directly so that you get all
Thank you,
those
Alex.
posts. They are very concise and to the point. So I really love your posts. In one of your posts, you mentioned that when talking about the mistakes specifically with their MVPs, you were saying that startup founders need to treat their MVPs as a test vehicle, as a way to learn about the actual needs and wants of the target group, right? And one of the things you were recommending there, things about the stats, to get the stats, visitors, transactions. Can you recommend some specific tools? What tends to work best in your experience for that?
Sure. And maybe we'll start with what is the problem that I see. Many times I go to startups, maybe they've actually already built a product. So I like, and the founder is like, hey, maybe the product is not working well, or I need help to add more features, or I'm not getting traction, and can you maybe just like advise us on how can I get traction? And the first question when I come in, I'm like, okay, great. Can you tell me how many users you have? Can you tell me, one, how many users you have? Two, how many of them are active? Three, how many of them kind of are engaged in the main product loop, like taking the action that you want them to take? And to my surprise, I don't find clear answers like, oh yeah, I'm gonna go look at the database, or I'm gonna go look there. Or I come in and my team is actually looking at the product, and maybe this is a product that's been in the market for a year, and they're like, hey, Shoukri, guess what? No Google Analytics, no Firebase Analytics, no prod support tools. And I'm like, oh man, then how are you learning if you don't get stats, if you don't know how many people are hitting your website or the tool itself? What are you learning by putting the MVP out there? Like, how would you're learning with no data. How? It doesn't work. And my recommendation is actually simple. The first thing is Google Analytics, like free, cheap, and at least it tells you how much traffic is hitting your website and how much of that traffic is actually taking the next action, which is the clicking your call to action button, subscribe, log in, sign up, whatever action you're pushing them to do. You want to say, I have 100 people hitting the page, out of which 90 are bouncing, 10 are there, 10 click the next one, and then where do they go? So the basic minimum, throw in a Google Analytics in there. If you have a mobile app, Firebase Analytics is a great one, and it kind of does exactly the same thing. And this just gives you some basic metrics about usage, downloads, installs, this stuff. The next one, there's different tools that I use for different elements of the learning. So one is a basic analytics thing. The second is user journey recording. And this is relevant when you don't quite, you can't sit next to the user and see what they're doing. Like, they're downloading a mobile app, you have no idea what they're doing. And you want to record that entire journey that they went through. Is it smooth? What are they clicking? Where do they get stuck? Do they kind of quit on the action halfway? You could do this without the user recording, but I find if you get like a journey recording, like a UX, there's a ton of products that do this. Just like Google, session recording or user journey recording, you'll find a ton of tools on that. Some of them are free to start. And so that kind of shows you what the user is going through. And I love these because sometimes watching them are so surreal. Like, you see them kind of suffering and you kind of feel the suffering of them at the moment. You're like, oh man, you don't see the button, it's here. And the crazy things is sometimes you've done an amazing job. You've mapped out the UI looks good and polished, but then the small button maybe is gray, right? Nobody can spot it easily. And you change that from gray to blue, and now you watch before the change and then you watch after the change. I'm like, oh, before everybody gets there and they're confused and skip it. And then you change the button color, and then all of a sudden everybody's doing the right action. You're like, yes, that's what we want. And so understanding what the user goes through from a journey, it becomes very important. The third one is more on the engineering side of things. Many projects that come to us after they've been developed by, let's say, other agencies, a lot of times they come to us and we start to look at the product, and I'm like, there is no logs, which is, for the non-technical audience in your audience, it's just, you want some files that say, here's what is happening in our backend. Oh, a user came, a user logged in, a user bought, a user didn't buy, this transaction failed for this reason, maybe the guy doesn't have funding. or maybe the credit card declined, or whatever these things are. You need some logs in your application that tell you here's what's happening, so that if there's a problem when you're live in production, you go to these logs and say, okay, I know user A reported a problem. Let's go look at everything that user A done, and you can see the calls, you can see kind of how he went through the app and where he hit the error. So logging, and then there's tools. I'll give you two example names. There's one called Sentry, there's another one called Rollbar. They're more like error reporting tools. So when a user experiences a crash, or an error or an exception is thrown, whether in the front end, which is like your web app, or in the mobile, or even in the backend, whenever an error that the system didn't handle happens, these tools just put it in a dashboard. And one of the things my team members do is, like, for every project we're involved in, for every team, one of the first tasks for the developers in the morning is to go and look at Rollbar, look at Sentry. Are there new errors? And the beauty of it is you find problems and fix them before the customer even, or the users even reported them. You come in every day, and just by virtue of having this tool, you're making the product better literally every single day. And this is what we want to see, right? And if we said when we started that the MVP is a learning tool, right? It's learning on different aspects. It's learning whether that thing solves the problem. It's learning also what other problems you create, because you solve one problem, right? And then you create other ones. And there's like rippling effects. Or going back to our, if you remember, we said sales tool as an example, right? So let's say we sell you a tool that bumps up your sales volume from 10 sales calls a day to 100 sales calls a day. But as you ramp up that volume, now maybe they have that organization now has a new problem, because how do I deal with that volume of calls, or like referrals or leads coming in? So now you can, as you put the solution to the customer and they start to use it, they're like, hey, by the way, this is great, it worked, it solved this, but it created this. And now as you're learning that, now you go and improve, build more features, and make the product better every day. And this is, I think, the other mistake that I see with founders, is that it takes them forever to do something, and startups live and die by momentum. Unfortunately, there's times when I meet founders who say, oh, I've been working at this startup for 3 years or 4 years. I'm like, 4 years of MVP, my friend, is too much, right? An MVP should be 6 months, 9 months. What is going on for you to be going 4 years? You're making a lot of mistakes in that case. Nobody should have an MVP 4 years later. Like, it shouldn't take you 4 years to launch an MVP. It should take you months, not years. And then, like, how much are you pivoting? Like, I don't think you should be staying in that unless you really, really know what you're doing and you really believe that you can solve the problem, and you tried many other things and failed, then fine. If it's gonna take you 4 years and you're building, something like hard tech, by all means fail. But if you're trying to build, I'm trying to give you an example without giving it a real example, but if you try to build an e-com site. If it's taking you 4 years to build an e-com site, you are absolutely doing it wrong. Time to look at what's going on. So yeah, the big problem is don't overbuild, build for learning. And the beauty of it is, if you don't overbuild and you give the customer just the thing to start, they'll tell you what they need next. So if you overbuild, you kind of build stuff that maybe is useful, but then you build the whole other things that are not useful at all, and nobody ever uses them, so you wasted the money. And the most valuable thing in your startup, number one, is really the discovery and the customers you find. The customer segment is the most valuable thing. The second most valuable thing, if you've identified the right segment and you've figured out the price point, then it becomes like the technology and the product. But first you have to get the users right, because the product without users is not really that valuable. It's a waste. And then the third thing you need to protect is your runway, because without it, guess what? You're dead. If you don't have enough money in the bank, like, you can have the greatest traction in the world, but no money in the bank and nobody to give you more money, you're toast. You're done, right? So runway is something that we encourage our founders that we work with, is protect that runway. And sometimes they're like, I want to build this. And I'm like, no, don't, just try to launch this first, see how that goes, and the user will tell you the next thing they need, right? Or you'll discover the next thing you need in conversation with them, versus build too much, or even worse. And I have extreme examples of that, Alex. I've been part of startups that burned multiple of millions of dollars doing this. They kind of knew what vertical they want to go after. However, if I looked in the room that we were in, nobody was an expert. And this is a mistake a lot of founders make. And I even wrote a nice piece on it called Don't Be a Parachute Founder. You meet founders who say, oh, I want to do AI for HR. I'm like, okay, fine, sounds good. What do you know about AI? Nothing. What do you know about HR? Nothing. Then I'm like, you can't solve a problem for a customer segment that you really don't understand if you insist. If this is your passion, by all means. But you need to go spend 6 months to a year either working there or shadowing somewhere there or interviewing like 100 to 1,000 people to know what you're doing. You have no edge. If you don't understand that space, you're an outsider. You don't have an edge if you don't understand the space. And so the best founder, in my opinion, are people who come from the space they're working in. That's one. Two, ideally, they themselves face that problem and they kind of figured out a solution for themselves, and by virtue of that, they're figuring out for others. So these are the founders that, well, everything, think of it this way, everything for these people is easier. They have already warm contacts. So they're not starting from zero customer base, zero relationships. They're starting with a Rolodex full of names and numbers that they can hit up for leads. Before they do anything, they already have that, right? If you're coming like as a parachute founder who just landed in that space, you're like literally starting with no experience, no contacts, no context. You don't speak the language. And this is an important one. So and I worked in so many domains. I've worked in like healthcare, I've worked in logistics, I've worked in travel, I've worked in insurance, I've worked in fintech, I've done crypto. So I've done, and I love this because like as I enter a new space or or kind of keep working in a space, there's that initial learning curve where you try to pick up the lingo and then you take one word and that one word has special meanings. I'm a CrossFitter, so CrossFit people, it's a cult. It's kind of like a cult. I don't say it's a cult, but they have terms for stuff, right? We say RX. If I say RX, Alex, to you, you might think, if I go to medical space, RX means prescription. RX in CrossFit, we're talking about the prescribed kind of workout and set and reps. So there's special lingo. If you go to CrossFit, there's a lingo. And if I take you back to ads or sales pages or landing pages, if you write things in your own language, it's not good. It's actually, you want the customer language. And keep in mind, there's two types of customer language. There's the problem language and then there's the solution language. And so the best sales pages and sales copy and ads speak the problem language. It's describing the problem how the customer describes it, not using your own words. Your own words pollute it. And so if you're an outsider, you don't speak the language, which makes everything harder for you.
So those are some very, very insightful points. And to summarize what I've gotten so far is that one of the most important things for you as a tech founder is to make sure that you use your MVP as a learning tool first and foremost, right?
Yes.
And use it to learn more about your customer needs and wants and tailor it to them. And I think you probably don't need more than one or two core features, right? The most important ones.
To go back to my extreme example, the startup I was mentioning earlier that went through a few $1 million, because they didn't have an expert in that domain, their answer is, let's go look at competition. Okay, let's go look at what competitors are doing and we'll copy the features, we'll probably copy the price point, maybe we'll lower it a little bit to compete. But I'm like, if you've done this, which I call feature parity, right? Feature parity is you go look and say, oh, this competitor has these 5 features, let's copy them. And then you look at another competitor who has like 10 other features, like, oh, we should copy them too, obviously. So you kind of copy them and you end up with something. I don't want to call it a product because a product has like a set, like these, there's a sense of cohesion. Like the product solves one problem, then the second, then the third. In that case, if you're trying to just like copy feature, you end up with a mishmash of tools, maybe a tool that does this, a tool that does that, but it doesn't do anything quite well and it doesn't really solve all the problems. And then with this mishmash, what's the worst thing is that with the mishmash, you might find some people interested in your solution and they'll talk to you. They'll go into initial sales call or 2 or 3, but then they'll soon discover that your product lacks depth, and it doesn't quite solve the problem. And then they're like, dude, like, yeah, this is not going to work. This is not the right product for us. And so don't copy features. Don't copy pricing. Pricing is a function of who the customer is and what the tool does for them. It's not because everybody, and I hear this all the time, it's like, oh, everybody in this space charges $50 a tool, like $50 for this, like $50 recurring. So my pricing strategy is just like everybody else, $50 recurring. And Alex Hormozy, in his book, in Offers book, like 100 Million Offers, he has this table that I'm like, when I saw it, I'm like, oh my God, this. Like, and I screenshot it, and every day I pull it once or twice, kind of share it with founders. He has a table that says, time management course, $19. Time management course for busy professionals, maybe $99. And then he has, like, you can see that as he narrows down the niche, like his last one is time management course for B2B gardening sales reps, $1,099, right? Why is the 10x? The 10x is, it's the same. Like, I'm teaching time management, but if you consider one, the impact on the buyer. If I look at the time management course, I'm like, okay, this probably has a mass market appeals to doctors and teachers and CTOs and marketers and everybody under the sun. But if you say this is, B2B sales reps who sell gardening tools, then for me, as like, if I'm in that space, if I'm the customer, I'm like, dude, this is designed for me. Like, this guy gets me. And so I'm probably willing to pay $1,099 for a training designed just for me. And if it's something that's mass appeal, yeah, I get the $19 price point. So this is also important. And that's how you come up with your pricing. Your pricing is a function of the value your solution brings, not what everybody else is doing in that space.
That's a great point to end our podcast on. But before you go, please remind our viewers and listeners what's the best way to connect with you on LinkedIn?
Yeah, so the best way is to find me on LinkedIn, only CTO. That's the easiest way. So that's my handle. Or you'll find me on bitlab.co. And I look forward to talk to all of you. If you need help with your technology, then you know where to look. And thank you, Alex, so much for hosting me today. It's been a fun conversation.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. I hope to have you back at some point in the future.
Thank you. Thanks, Alex.